There we go. Okay, I'm now handing over to Dr. Beth Nicholls from Sussex University, who's going to be, and the Buzz Club, I should say,
Mhm.
who's going to be talking about when is citizen science a useful approach. Over to you, Beth.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so I'll be taking kind of a zoomed out approach to think about kind of when might organizations or scientists want to use citizen science. Um, I'll be talking about what some of the benefits and some of the challenges are of using this approach to collect data, and thinking about when it might be most appropriate. And then I will present a case study from mine and Dave's research, and talk a little bit about some of the lessons we learned from kind of designing and running that citizen science project. Um, so the Oxford English Dictionary defines citizen science as the collection and analysis of data by members of the general public, typically in collaboration with professional scientists. And this was only kind of defined as a term in 2014. But I actually think this definition is slightly lacking because some of the most exciting and interesting citizen science projects that I know about actually involve the public and the citizen scientists in designing the research question as well and designing the method. And this, in kind of academia, we would call co-creation of research. And those can be, as I say, some of the most exciting projects. In the life sciences and natural sciences, we tend to use the term citizen science. But as I collaborate more with kind of social scientists, I'm learning that there are many different terms for kind of involving the public and volunteers in data collection. So it can also be known as community science or participatory action research as well. So those might be other terms to look out for reading more about science. And as I say, it's a new term, but it's definitely not a new phenomenon at all. So, particularly in the UK, we have a really long history of biological recording. And so, organisations that Dave has already mentioned, such as the BTO, have these huge monitoring schemes. The Butterfly Conservation, Bee Wars, and the Botanical Society, all collating data that is generated by the public. And I hesitate to call them non-experts because some of those recorders have incredible knowledge of very specific taxa. And some of the data that we use as scientists, or a lot of the data, I should say, that we use as scientists to look at kind of long-term trends in populations of species, has all been generated by volunteers, members of the public, people who are not professional scientists. And the very best projects, that data then ends up at places like the Biological Records Centre, where then scientists and conservation organisations can access that data and use that data to really inform management decisions or to advise policymakers. So this data that's generated by members of the public, by volunteers, by amateurs, but who have this specialist knowledge is really important and really valuable. Um, and one of the reasons why there's been quite an explosion, I guess, in citizen science projects is that now we all have this amazing technology that we carry around in our pockets that has a camera on it, that has access to the internet, that allows us to share that data really easily. But it also allows us to kind of get verification from other experts in real time through programs such as Seek or iNaturalist. Um, but it also has, the ability to record GPS locations, and to do many other kind of really cool things in something that a lot of people have access to. So that's really increased the opportunity for involving members of the public in data collection for science. Um, and so Dave's already given quite a few examples, but I just wanted to talk about some of the different types of citizen science projects with a focus really on natural history kind of projects. So there are sort of one-off events like the Big Butterfly Count or the Big Garden Bird Watch. I'm not sure why they all have to be big, but I think it's to kind of signify the fact that they involve lots of people. And these typically will happen on kind of a single weekend. And lots of people can join in. The methods are pretty simple. They don't require any specialist equipment. and people often will take part with their families, and then the data gets collated across a large area. Other organisations, such as the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, will have regular opportunities to submit data. So BCT have their Bee Walks programme, and so people sign up to sampling a particular transect, so they'll walk the same route sort of periodically throughout the summer, recording bumblebees. And again, that data is generated over several months and years by the same person taking part. Sorry, I'll try and be less animated, which is really difficult for me, but hopefully that improves the sound quality. And so then there are other types of project, which is something that I guess the Buzz Club specialises in, where participants are asked to conduct an actual experiment. So this is where they might be sent out specialist equipment, or they might be asked to utilise things that they have in their own garden, and they might set up different treatments and look at the impact. So this is an example from our Strawberries Rocks project, where we were trying to see whether kind of painting strawberries, so making stones that look like a strawberry, popping them in a grow bag, and then seeing if this kind of deters birds that might come and eat those strawberries. So a kind of non-chemical way of deterring those organisms that kind of compete with us for the food that we're trying to grow in our gardens, for example. And then there are projects where the scientists themselves have generated the data, and they might have generated thousands and thousands of pictures or lots and lots of audio recordings. And then people from kind of the comfort of their living room with a cup of tea sign up to go through those pictures and count penguins on a rock, or listen to frog calls and try to ID the different species. So there's a website called Zooniverse, which I recommend checking out, where there are lots and lots of different projects where you can kind of take part. Some of them require quite a lot of training, and you have to pass a special test to be able to take part. But other ones you can just dip in and out of and count some penguins instead of scrolling on Twitter, for example. So those are some different types of projects. And then a project that I think is really interesting and is a really great example of co-created research, which I mentioned as being quite an exciting aspect of citizen science, is the Noise Project, which is led by Cornell University over in the States. And their Centre for Ornithology do some really amazing citizen science projects. So they're behind the Merlin phone app that you might have that helps to identify birds from kind of listening to the recordings. But they designed, or co-designed, I should say, a project with marginalized groups in urban areas across the States, looking at monitoring the impacts of noise pollution, which often disproportionately affects marginalized people, and working with those people to identify areas that are very noisy, identifying refuges, and monitoring the impacts of that on people, and start to identify kind of mitigation strategies. And what I think is really nice about this project is that they very clearly set out kind of that the scientists would not necessarily be kind of top down leading the project, but that everybody taking part in the project is a co-investigator. So there was a lot of equity between the people taking part in the project, and they have really interesting kind of codes of conduct and co-created guidelines around what the data can be used for, how the data is collected, and that kind of thing. So check it out if you're interested. I think it's a really nice example of how you can involve participants as well in designing methods. So in terms of the benefits of citizen science, I guess there's two sides to this. We can think about the benefits to the organizations or the scientists, and we can also think about the benefits to the participants as well. So for the organizations, citizen science is kind of typically thought as being a relatively low cost way of covering a really large area. So as Dave highlighted, we can monitor across the whole of the UK or maybe across Europe. We can potentially process large volumes of data, so we can involve citizen scientists in looking at pictures, for example. But I think one of the amazing benefits is that it can also allow us to monitor things long term. So as Dave mentioned, it can be really hard to get funding for long-term monitoring projects through traditional routes. The citizen science offers a potential solution for that. Again, if you're involving people in design of the research or in design of the research questions, you get a really unique input into that design of the research question. And sometimes that can lead to unexpected insights. And also, it's a really good tool for engaging with people as well. So sometimes maybe the data that's generated isn't of as high accuracy as it might be if it was generated by a professional scientist, but it has this other benefit of engaging a particular group with your research field or with a conservation topic. And that in turn has been shown in several projects to then lead to behaviour change. So it can encourage people to engage more in pro-environmental behaviours. For example, not littering, reducing plastic use, or planting for wild insects. So it can be really good as a tool to kind of engage people, but also affect kind of positive change in people's behaviour as well. For people taking part in citizen science, they get that improved understanding. They might have a better understanding of how science works. But there's some interesting studies showing it doesn't always work. So people's understanding doesn't necessarily increase just as a function of taking part in a citizen science study. So it is important, if that is one of your goals for your citizen science project, that you kind of think about how you will measure people's changing understanding, changing engagement, and you design it in such a way that you enable people to kind of learn through participating. But it can be a really good way for people to learn new skills. So perhaps young people who want to go into the field of ecology or become scientists, this gives them an opportunity to find out what it's really like to collect data. And again, because you're involving people in the data collection, in perhaps the design, perhaps the questions you're asking, it could potentially lead to us having more research projects that are addressing questions that people are interested in. So a lot of our research is publicly funded, and to that end, it really should be addressing questions that people think are important or that will help to improve people's lives as well. So that can be a potential benefit of a citizen science approach as well. So some of the challenges I've already touched on a little bit. So maybe some of you have already seen this on Twitter. It's quite a famous example. I'm sure it's nothing to do with the authors and all to do with the editors, but that is not a bee on the copy of the Bees of the World book. And anyone who's tried to identify bees or other insects in the field knows that it can be really tricky. And so accuracy of the data, if you're asking people who are not kind of professionals to collect your data, is quite an important factor. So that means that you might need to think about the complexity of the methods or the detail that you're asking people to collect in their data collection. I said that people typically think of citizen science as being this low-cost option. I mean, you're outsourcing all the work, right? So it must be cheaper. But it's really important to have a successful citizen science project that you invest in the resources to provide really good training for people and also to support people. So to kind of answer any questions and to make sure that you're encouraging kind of continued participation if that's important for your project. And citizen science projects do often have very high dropout rates. So we all know what it's like. You get really excited about a project, you sign up, you do all the training, and then, you know, life gets in the way. So that's something that you kind of need to factor in when you're recruiting people. If your project requires kind of sustained data collection from the same area, you might need to recruit extra people to account for that dropout. Or you might need to have some kind of mitigation plan for that. And another issue, I think, is competition between projects as well. So there's lots of projects that are asking people to do very similar things, record the same groups, for example. And I think that's okay as long as all of the data is kind of going into a public repository where anyone can access it. But I think sometimes we maybe need to have a bit more joined up thinking and checking, okay, is there already a project that's kind of generating similar data? And might it be better to kind of collaborate with the people who are generating that data if they're open to that, as long as we're kind of asking different questions, or could we design a project that's compatible with an existing one, for example? So in terms of mitigating those challenges, in terms of accuracy of data, there's very different ways. So you can reduce the complexity of your method, or you can include some component of kind of data validation. So in a project that was led by Janine, who's here today, another Buzz Club member, she had people growing mini meadows in their kind of back gardens, and then using pan trapping to survey for insects. But she wasn't asking them to identify the insects. She asked them to have a go, but then all the samples got posted back to her, and she was IDing them as someone who is a professional scientist. So that means the species level ID was done by someone who is professionally trained in that. Apps like iRecord or websites like iRecord allow people to upload photos and then have those identifications validated by someone, again, who is an expert or is very familiar with that group. And increasingly, we're seeing the use of AI as well to help with identification. Not perfect by any means, but it is kind of one tool that people can use to kind of get, I guess, on the right path to identification. And the data and the photos are there that could be scrutinized at a later date by people who have some more expertise in a particular group, for example. In terms of providing training, one way that you can kind of lessen the burden on the central organizer or the scientist is to kind of have some peer learning or to have some support hubs. So you can train an ambassador, for example, who will kind of lead on that training for you across the UK. So in-person training can work really well. So you can invest a lot in some volunteers or some ambassadors that then pass on that training to their peers, and that can work really well. One option for mitigating high dropout rates is to have some kind of reward or compensation for participants, or to make data collection sort of competitive in some way. But you have to make sure that the data being submitted is valid, and there isn't kind of a temptation for people maybe to kind of just keep bunging in data that maybe isn't super accurate. So there's a trade-off there. And I think in terms of getting people interested in your project, having a really clear, simple method and the motivation being clear. And as I say, checking that it doesn't kind of compete with a very similar project that's generating very similar data. And so I personally found this resource by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology researchers, who are really experts in kind of designing citizen science and leading on these projects, really useful. And this table in particular kind of is a sort of at a glance summary of all the things I've been talking about, and helps you kind of decide when citizen science is the right approach. So it's important to have a clear aim. It's important that you really want to engage people in the research. You do need some resources to support those people. And it's particularly good if you're looking to sample a large area over a long time period. But it's key that you have a kind of simple protocol, and that the reasons for people getting involved and what you're going to do with the data, for example, should be clear to the participants to encourage engagement. So really the suitability kind of depends on what the aims are of your research or of your conservation project. So great if you want to engage people. It can be really good tool for upskilling people. If you want high quality data, then you might need to think very carefully about how you're monitoring. So maybe you have something that's very automated. So these people in this picture here have a little gadget that sits on their phone that automatically is collecting air pollution data. So there's not that much technical skills needed other than having the phone and going on these walks. So that can be a really good way of getting very precise data, but not requiring too much training or prior knowledge. The other thing you could do is actually harness the knowledge of amateurs in their specific specialist subject. So I was involved in a fixed point photography project when I worked for a conservation organisation, where we recruited people who were already really keen on photography to take part in a project, to take photos, to monitor the success of heathland management in a particular part of the South Downs. So there we were kind of building on a pre-existing. And then, of course, it's really good if you can to incorporate some method for validating those results. So be that photo verification, or having training and a kind of mini exam maybe that your participants have to take, or kind of, oh, it's completely gone, but yeah, so some method for validating the results. And then lastly, I won't dwell on this too much, but I think it is really important to think of the ethics of involving unpaid people in data collection. So I think it's really important to think about who owns that data once it's collected, and that you're very upfront about that, that you're upfront about how the data is going to be used, that you consider any conflicts of interest between what the data will be used for and who is participating in the data collection. So, you know, if you're collecting data around kind of land management or a new development, just checking that no one taking part maybe has a vested interest in that land being developed in some way, for example, and making sure that you're kind of not exploiting people and using their kind of goodwill and their free time for, you know, your own gains, I suppose. And again, the noise project that I mentioned before has really interesting kind of documentation and guidelines that they developed as a team with the participants around how data could be used and ownership and that kind of thing. So just some important things to consider if you are designing a citizen science project from scratch. So now in the last few minutes of the talk, I just wanted to give an example from kind of a project that myself and Dave led on called Team Pollinate, which was looking at urban growing and kind of what we learned from designing that experiment. And I'll leave it up to you to ponder who from the Buzz Club team is inside the giant bee in this picture, but it is someone on this call right now. So in the scientific community, there is a real interest in sort of harnessing the power of citizen science for monitoring the huge number of targets and even bigger number of indicators that have been set out for the United Nations member states to try and achieve these sustainable development goals over the near future. So each one of these goals has a number of targets and then an even higher number of indicators that to measure whether we're kind of achieving and going in the right direction, we need some data to support. So there's been quite a few recent papers looking at the potential for citizen science to contribute towards this monitoring. And that's because obviously many of the member states are in developing countries which maybe don't have a lot of money to push towards kind of training scientists or supporting professional scientists, but maybe they could kind of develop rigorous protocols that could be shared across the member states that would allow some monitoring to go on. And the second paper that I just put up here actually identified that two areas where citizen science is contributing and has a really good potential to contribute is towards the life on land goal and the sustainable cities and communities goal. So these two goals are around kind of making our urban environments nicer to live in, you know, not having an adverse effect on people's quality of life, on the environment, and also preserving biodiversity and enabling the flourishing of biodiversity as well. And so our project was kind of building on these two goals, and it aimed to look at what some of the benefits might be of urban food production for both food security and biodiversity. And so we had a couple of objectives. We really wanted to understand which insects are pollinating crops grown in urban areas, how much food could you grow in a small urban area, and what are the pest control methods, so the pesticides that people might be using in these urban growing spaces, because that really isn't being monitored at all. And so we recruited volunteer growers, allotment growers, people who grow at home across the city of Brighton and Hove, where the university is based. And once they were recruited, I went to allotments and gave them some training in how to identify pollinators and how to collect data. And so we asked people to conduct pollinator surveys, and I designed kind of a little methodology to enable them to do that. We were only asking people to identify to these kind of broad groups, thinking about the fact that it's very hard to identify many pollinators to specific groups at a species level if you're not an expert in that group. We asked people to keep a pest control diary, so what kind of pests did they encounter and what did they do about them? And then we asked people to kind of weigh the produce that they harvested. And then I also went to their allotments, collected data to kind of validate that data as well. And Linda, who's going to talk a bit later, also developed this really cool widget that would enable people to kind of calculate how much that food was worth and what the contribution was of pollinators to the production of that food as well, which people really liked, and that project is ongoing, and you can still download this widget and use it if you're interested, if you're a grower. And so in terms of results dissemination, of course, it was really important that we gave those results back to all those participants. So I designed a kind of infographic that we host on the website, an actual leaflet for people to hand out to other growers between the 2 years of the study, so we could recruit more people over the course of the study and try to just pick out kind of those headline results rather than going into lots of detail. It was really interesting. We found which crops were most attractive. We found people were harvesting a lot of food and that pollinators were playing an important role, and that people weren't using a lot of pesticides, which was quite good. But of course, we also wanted to disseminate these results to a wider audience. So once we published some kind of research papers, we also got quite a lot of kind of national coverage and international coverage. So the work was kind of featured in The Guardian. We wrote some popular science articles, did some terrifying kind of live interviews. So there was reach to this research, although the data, was being collected in collaboration between me and the citizen scientists. So I just wanted to show that this work can have big impact. And then, of course, we published in the kind of traditional route to our scientific peers as well. And one really cool thing from this project is that we actually ended up with a spin-off project that was led by Janine that was kind of co-created, I would say, with the citizen scientists. So when we were chatting to them, they were noticing that often they weren't seeing very many pollinators on their crops, but they were seeing them on all the other wildflowers and weeds that they had in their allotment. And they got really concerned that maybe the bees were being distracted, or the pollinators. So Janine designed this really cool experiment that a subset of people took part in, and people across the UK, where they designed a little experiment where they would have a strawberry plant that was either next to or away from some very bee attractive flowers, and then look at the yield of the fruits. And thankfully, we were able to say that no, it's actually a good thing if you have these wildflowers in your crop, in your allotments, because we found that the plants that were next to the borage actually produced more and bigger fruit. I was actually quite relieved to not have to tell people, oh, you're going to have to rip up all your all your nice flowers. So it was a nice result in that sense, but a really cool kind of spin-off from a question that was raised by the volunteers themselves. And so looking back at my data, I think it's kind of interesting to compare. So one thing that stood out is that the citizen scientists conducted a lot less surveys than I did, because it wasn't their jobs, right? It was my kind of full-time job. But they recorded nearly as many interactions. So that suggests to me that maybe we were following the protocols slightly differently, perhaps because people were getting a little bit demotivated that they weren't seeing that many insects on their crops. Maybe they were waiting a bit longer, or, saying, oh, it nearly landed on the crop, because they were really keen to kind of submit data to the project. We also found that they tended to over-report flies compared to me, which was really surprising, and under-report certain bees, such as bumblebees and honeybees, which was kind of surprising. and actually I thought bumblebees were quite charismatic, but it just shows that there might have been some differences in identification as well. Oh, I can't move forward. There we go. In terms of submissions, we actually only had about 18% of volunteers submitting data. That's pretty standard for certain citizen science projects. We were asking people to do a lot, but what was nice is that we held some focus groups between the first and second year to ask people why they didn't take part and to get some feedback. So people really liked taking part. They said it really made them think more about pollinators. It made them more observant. They said that they would have a more inclusive attitude to insects. There was some evidence of kind of behavior change there, and they learned that there was more than bees that were pollinating. But it was really interesting to see what they found difficult and what made it hard for them. So they were really concerned about how accurate the data was, and that wasn't something that I'd necessarily considered might put people off. They didn't want to sit on the computer. They go to the allotment to kind of get away from that. And of course, time was a limit. And then we asked them, how could we make things better? So they asked us to kind of explain that, it doesn't matter if you miss a week, maybe to explain that the data is going into kind of a bigger data set. That's something that we maybe understand as scientists, but for individual participants, it might be hard to see the bigger picture. And so we incorporated some of these suggestions. We had more hands-on training, and we made different parts of the survey more optional. And we gave more monthly updates, and we provided the option to kind of post the data. So we made a little paper diary so people didn't have to go on their computer, and that massively increased the data submission. So I would really recommend, if you are designing a citizen science project, to listen to your participants, to try and factor in some time to pilot the project and get feedback from them. So I think, in summary, citizen science can really benefit both the scientists and the participants, and it works really well if you want to monitor over a long time or over a really large area. And it can be a really cool way to engage people with your research or with your conservation topic. And it can increase inclusion and equity in terms of who gets to participate in science and learn about science. The challenges are sometimes the data might not be as accurate as if it was collected by a professional scientist, depending on the design. And you can get high dropout rates, so you need to factor that in or try to mitigate that in some way. And you definitely need to provide ongoing training and support. You can't just set up a project and expect people to just run with it. And so it's really good to have a clear aim when resources when engagement is important to you, and when you have kind of a simple protocol. And yeah, I would really recommend kind of piloting the data and getting some feedback from the participants. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on or in the chat.
Thanks, Beth.